Yes. Before I take roll call, I would like to introduce our newest member, Rob Winterberg. He replaces a vacancy left by John Stitt, and we're happy to have him and a new face on the board, so welcome. And with roll call, Member Janes.
Here.
Member Dornbecker. Here. Member Lamborn.
Present.
Member Winterberg.
Here.
And Chair Halliday.
Here.
All present.
Adoption of the agenda. May I have a motion?
I'll move to approve.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
The agenda has been adopted. There are no minutes. Is there anyone in the public who would like to speak on matters not on the agenda? Seeing none, there's nothing on the consent calendar, which leads us to item 7.1, the mission statement for the ZDRB.
And the item before you is a potential mission statement, and this was suggested by Chair Halliday at the meeting in June. And it lists the statement that she's proposed in the staff report, and the staff report also explains the decision-making and advisory capacity of the board. So it's open for discussion amongst you.
Well, I think it is a very good idea, actually, to have this mission statement, and I don't see anything that I disagree with. It may want to tweak it, but I don't see anything that substantively I disagree with.
Thank you. Jason?
I've already expressed my antipathy towards mission statements in general, so it would be rude for me to belabor the point.
Okay. Matt?
I don't feel strongly one way or the other about mission statement. My favorite sentence is the last sentence. It's the most colorful, but I also I'm concerned about the subjectivity of the statement, and if we were to adopt this as presented, I would request that that last sentence be omitted.
Okay, fair enough. Rob?
I guess when I was considering this, I went around and asked people about their mission statements in different organizations, and nobody could tell me any of their mission statements, first off, though they all said we had one, but they didn't know what it was. So I think that goes a little bit to what Jason James is saying, that I kind of feel like they're we can have them, we cannot have them. I don't have a real strong opinion, but it seems like they don't get a lot of use. And this sounded just like a description of the Zoning and Design Review Board more than a mission statement to me.
Okay, that's fair enough, and I'm going to defend it. I think we need a mission statement. This is not a Girl Scout group. We're dealing with people who are heavily invested. I think they need to know that we have a goal, that there are parameters in what we do, and on that basis, I defend it. I think it does more good than harm. As to that last sentence, and the reason I wrote that is when you're in Las Vegas, it's a fine line between being noticed and being garish. And we skirt that stuff here. We are a tourist town. The people who come to us with commercial ventures want to be remembered, and sometimes they go way over the top. And that's why I included that. But it could be rewritten. I'm not in love with the verbiage. I think I stole most of it. And I would love to get you to put your energy behind it.
Well, I must admit, too, that that last sentence was bothersome to me.
Okay.
And I do think that if we are going to adopt a mission statement, that has to be reworked. I don't feel comfortable because it is so subjective to say what is an aspect of elegance and decorum. And I mean, we do all meet and discuss these commercial endeavors in the town, but I really haven't seen anything that I would ever compare to Las Vegas in Yountville.
Well, you didn't see Luke before it had a tower that was 30 feet high. Some of these things go. Yeah.
I see.
So Jason, would you participate even though you feel antipathy toward it?
No,
Okay, so you're just going to stay out of the loop.
that's right.
Okay. I regret that, but yeah. So is there anyone else that wants to simply abstain?
I'm kind of on the fence with this. I'm concerned about spending a lot of time on refining this. I think there's a lot of other things that we're trying to focus on, the green design and things that are coming forth that I just don't know if I'd have enough energy and time to really give it my all for a mission statement. And I think the other issue is that it's also going to be hard to encompass everything we do and everything we strive for in a single mission statement that makes sense to everyone and that isn't so long that people, will read it.
So how would it be if we all went home and worked on this a little bit and submitted something for next month? Would you be willing to do that?
I'd be willing to give it a shot.
How about you, Rob?
Sure.
Sure. Okay, let's do that then. We'll just table this for the time being and go on to the next, which brings us to the Yountville Tasting Station.
This item before you is an amendment to the master sign program for the Whistle Stop Center, and it applies to Building C, which is the location of the newly approved Yountville Tasting Station. And that building houses two different businesses, the other being Coldwell Banker. And the applicant is proposing 4 new business identification signs. 3 of those replace signs used by Images Fine Art, and they're the 3 that are located on the east, south, and west elevations. The one on the west elevation faces the parking lot, and it's not under analysis or discussion tonight since signs that don't face the public right-of-way don't go toward the sign allotment. So the applicant is proposing those signs as well as a new sign for the east elevation that would be north of the north-situated door, and this is a smaller sign, approximately 4.5 square feet, where the other signs are 10 square feet each. They would match the design and materials of the existing Images Fine Art sign and the others that are found on the Whistle Stop Center, and those are the carved wood signs with the brown background and the raised white lettering and border. And the copy on the signs would identify Yountville Tasting Station on the top 1/3. The larger signs would identify the 2 wineries that are involved in the wine tasting room, and the smaller sign would identify the retail goods, which are salt, spices, olive oils, and chocolates. And there is no lighting proposed for these signs. So staff looked at really 2 issues. One was the total sign area and whether that was within the total allowed, and also the total number of signs. And because this is a master sign plan property, it gets a larger amount of signage, and additionally, it's a corner property. So it's allocated 75 square feet, and what is proposed is substantially under that, so it conforms to that standard. The number of signs, though, exceed what is generally permitted, and that's 1 building sign per frontage, in addition to a monument sign. And so the 2 signs that are being replaced on the south and east elevations conform to that standard. The one that we're considering tonight is the smaller sign that adds a second sign to the west elevation, or the east elevation. And staff is supportive of this second sign for a couple of reasons. First, that this site doesn't really have what's known as a monument sign that identifies the different businesses to help someone realize what's on site. It identifies the center itself without identifying the businesses. And so the signs provide the additional signage for the business. The second sign also identifies the retail component and provides a different level of information to patrons and customers. It's especially important in staff's opinion because of the retail diversity policy and the fact that standalone wine tasting rooms aren't allowed, and that's more the norm. So to let the public know that there's a whole retail component is important. For those reasons, we support it. An exception has to be made for that second sign on the east elevation because it technically exceeds the maximum allowed by the code. So we've made those findings, and we're asking you to accept those if you approve this sign and the exception.
Okay, thank you. Good staff report. Is there anyone that wants to speak on this issue? Yes.
Speak briefly. My name is Craig Camp of Cornerstone Cellars and the Tasting Station. The retail space is really divided into two units. You know, it's spread out, almost designed for two stores. So we wanted to add the second sign because there are two main entrances, and our secondary retail focus of the chocolates and salts are going to be focused in that other section. So we wanted to bring attention to that. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to close the public hearing and bring it to the board. What do we think? Matt, what do we think?
I think staff makes a good argument for the exception on the small sign on the east elevation, I think it is. So I don't have any problems with that. The design of the signs are simple, tasteful. I appreciate how they've done this, and comments.
All is well support the granting of the exception. I would just emphasize on the findings, I think, two crucial things. One is that the retail policy is more recent than the sign ordinance, and that's an important thing, that perhaps the sign ordinance should be updated to reflect a new retail policy. And secondly, I can't imagine we would object if the application were to create a new demising wall between the spaces and have two separate tenants, which would perforce allow two separate signs. There was one comment in the staff report, I wouldn't make it a condition of approval, but I would encourage the applicant to make the sign grammatically correct, or at least cogent, because what is rare and what's not rare, is it all rare? But the misplaced comma seems odd. It's certainly up to you, but I would fix it were I you. It's not necessarily a condition, so that's all.
Rita.
I have no objections.
Ron?
I guess I have more of a question for staff than anything. What constitutes not facing the street? Because I feel the Yountville Deli sign had to go through a review, and it doesn't face the street, but can be seen from the street.
It's a fine line we walk. That one is more visible, so we thought that that should go before the board for review. But it is somewhat subjective. This one, we feel it's definitely tucked behind the building and not visible from the public right away.
All right, that's all I've got. I think it's great.
And you will eliminate that comma? Yes. Thank you. We wish you well. It's hard to make a living. It's a new concept, and we all wish you well. May I have a motion?
Move to approve as presented.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Congratulations. Done well. Summerston Wine Company,
Madam Chair, I'm recusing myself from discussion on this item.
on what basis?
As I've previously disclosed, my employer owns the adjacent complex, and while it's an indirect conflict. I have no ownership interest, nor is my compensation based on the performance of Piazza Quercia. Subsequent to the previously existing building's demolition, it's become necessary for us to have friendly discussions with the adjoining property's construction manager about some mutual areas of concern, and so moving forward, I don't think it's appropriate for me to discuss the property.
Thank you. So we will continue. May we have the staff report?
The item before you is another master sign plan for the Sorrento property, the newly approved buildings that are on Washington Street. And there are several signs proposed for the two different buildings. The north building is the site of the Summerston Wine Company's tasting room and retail operation, and they're proposing several signs. First, on the west elevation are signs that are 8-inch black metal letters that are affixed to the building. On the left and between the windows, on the first and second floor, they read Summerston Wine Company in a slight arch, and this would be surrounded by a dark red painted border. Slightly to the south of that and over the entry are the same black metal letters proposed, reading wine tasting. On the north elevation, the applicant is proposing a antiqued tin metal sign that would be painted in the same dark red and indicating Summerston Wine Company. Also on that elevation is a single mural that's in two different panels proposed to the north, or above and below that sign. The south building is for a future tenant, and the applicant is proposing a valence sign of 4.5 square feet. Both buildings also propose etched and gold-leafed window signs, for the north building and one for the south building, and no illumination is proposed. Staff's review of this project looked at the total sign area, the total number of signs. It looked at the window signs and the mural. And based on the two buildings, building frontage on Washington, the site is entitled to 32 square feet of signage, and what's proposed at 32.5 square feet is slightly over that, so we're recommending a condition that it be scaled back and that be removed from the north building because of the difference in allocations between those two buildings. And with that, then it would be within the total sign allotment they are permitted. Excuse me. The allocation of signage is not entirely even. As I've mentioned, the south building is proposing 4.5 square feet, where it would be entitled to up to 11.5 square feet. So it's disproportionate to the site's total area, and we just want to raise that for the board's consideration. We're not opposed to that, but due to the fact that businesses tend to want the most signage that they can, this will be a limitation to that tenant. But when you're aware of what you have to use, generally you comply with that. The number of signs exceeds the maximum number that are allowed, and as I mentioned in the last staff report, that's generally one wall-mounted sign per building frontage in addition to a monument sign. And the signs that exceed the standard are located on the north building. There are two on the north elevation and a third sign on the north elevation. And staff looked first at the west signs, and these could be combined to be a single sign and be within the standard and conform to that requirement. However, staff supports the two that are proposed because of the limited wall area based on windows and doors, and it makes sense to split the signage up, and it balances the building. So we're not opposed to breaking that up. The sign on the north elevation would replace the monument sign in a sense, and staff also supports that sign because this is a small two-tenant property, and monument signs really are better geared toward larger properties to identify buildings that don't front the street. This sign is located at the driveway, and in a sense it serves a directional purpose that a monument sign typically achieves as well. So we are supporting that sign. And we've laid out the exception findings for both of those signs, the wine tasting on the west and the one on the north elevation. The window signs are analyzed in terms of being window signs, and those are signs that are permanently maintained or painted in a window and are intended to be viewed from outside. And the etched and gold-leafed signs would achieve that, and they should be counted toward the site's sign allotment, based on the fact that they clearly meet that definition. So to work with this applicant and to encourage signage that is different and unique, we could support the etched signs, but we are recommending that they be etched only and without the gold leaf, so that they're within their total signage allotment. The mural was the last item that we looked at, and the main issue in staff's mind is whether the mural conveys a sign image. And a sign image, a sign message would be should be counted toward the sign allotment. And these two murals total 60 square feet, so they would exceed that if a mural were to fall into a sign category. And the ordinance is silent on whether a mural should or could be considered a sign. And staff looked to the definition of display area for signs. What I was telling to staff is that a sign is an area that is capable of conveying a message. So it is important, in our opinion, what that mural is. And it's a conceptual mural before you. They would proceed to revise that design and bring it back if there's support that it isn't signage. The conceptual mural depicts a vineyard landscape. And in staff's opinion, this doesn't directly advertise the business. It's also similar to murals you find on European buildings, and they add to the character and flavor of town. It definitely is an artistic statement, and staff thinks it could contribute a lot to this building. The one thing staff did look at was the fact that the applicants mentioned that they favor the French art posters that tend to use wine glasses and wine bottles, and maybe that could be construed as conveying a sign message. We know it's a hard call, so we're just throwing that out to you for your discussion. But staff feels that the mural could be a very nice element to the building and contribute to the total package. So we're supporting the signs. And we're even supportive of the mural, so we would give it to you for discussion.
Thank you. Before we go on, it seems to me that we have two separate issues here. One is the signage, and the other is what is our posture on murals? Should be completely separate, no? What do you think? You know, they're on the Hill family. They have a mural, and it's permitted.
Well, murals are a part of our town sign ordinance, but as I said, it's silent on whether that mural can be a sign, and I think that it's a fine line. There are instances when a mural can very definitely be a sign, say a Coca-Cola sign on a business selling that.
Exactly.
So there's some...
Do we need to determine that before we continue, or can that wait till for a later date?
No, that should be part of your discussion tonight, I would suggest.
Okay.
So we do not know what is planned for the murals?
Well, is
I see, in the booklet on page 4, I see something. Is that the actual?
No, that's a conceptual idea. They didn't want to put the effort into it if
I see.
it's not supported. I think they may have refined it more, and they may be willing to answer that question.
I think you're going to tell.
David Zarowski with Somerson Wine Company. The mural idea is really, we're bringing it to the table to you guys to really determine what you feel is appropriate. We don't necessarily want to include it in the signage, and we don't want it to necessarily encourage people to understand what's inside the building. Just that one of our primary focuses is, if you look at the sign that's on Washington Street right now, we state that it's about wine, local artists, and ranching. And the wine part is the primary right now, local artists is the other primary, and then ranching, because we're growing lamb on the property. Well, the local artist part of it will be displaying a fair amount of local artwork within the space. But we wanted to bring that local artist to that space and give it a nice little complement to the town of Yountville. And the mural doesn't necessarily have to be a vineyard. It could even be just an artist's expression of whatever it is that we feel is best to fit that space. And so we're bringing it to you this evening as to kind of determine what you feel the boundaries are, the limitations are, so that we're not necessarily depicting somebody cheersing wine glasses and that it's about having a party in there, more so that it's about bringing an element of an artist element to the town of Yountville that would support several local muralists or artists themselves.
Oh. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. How's that for subjective consideration?
I appreciate the applicant's efforts, and I think these 10 painted murals would be a tremendous asset to the building, to the town, to the streetscape down there. In my mind, I don't see any gray area. I see these as pinned to the building in exactly the same way as the Summerston Wine Company sign on that frontage, and to me, it's a 3-panel sign. They're associated with the sign, and I think they're just part of a larger sign array. And so I think if they were disassociated and they were somewhere else on the building, and I know this is starting to split hairs, but my concern is by calling these murals and having them more or less not physically connected, but visually connected to the sign itself, we're setting a precedent for further signs and murals and those types of things. And I don't want to discourage the applicant from the murals, because I think they're excellent, but I think we need to be careful about how they're arranged on the building.
Mind if I speak again real quick? So that's why we brought it to the table, is we thought that would be the most appealing option, was to bring the idea of having a similar profile, so that didn't look like we were attacking the building with a bunch of paint. But if it's in better interest from the town of Yountville standpoint that we paint an actual mural right onto the building itself, then that is an option that we're wide open to consideration. So if that seems more appropriate from the mural standpoint, being that it's actually painted right onto the building itself, that it disassociates itself specifically from that distressed tin sign that's on the side of the building, then that would be the direction that we're opening it up to you guys to help us make that decision on what we think or what you think would be best for that space, that building, for the town, and not necessarily discourage us from or adding additional signage to or asking for that exception, whatever it comes down to.
Certainly.
Robert Sanders, consultant, but staff, we had worked real closely with staff about this, and they had suggested that we, split it specifically away from the sign so that we have a top mural and a bottom. So we were trying to show differentiation between the signs. We're not trying to sneak the sign in with the murals. So we've been working on some way to deal with the murals. So
Sure.
Thank you. I'm going to close the, do you have a question?
I'd just like to say that to me, the difference between a mural and a French art poster, and I love France, but I don't like the idea of bottles and glasses of wine as a mural, personally, and I have to express that. But I think landscapes and the beautiful, showing the beautiful surroundings, an artist interpretation of that, I could see as a mural. But anyway, and I am troubled that it could easily start looking just like a really big sign, and that isn't this on the facing the driveway?
yes.
north elevation now. I guess it's hard for me to make a recommendation not knowing what you're planning, what the artwork would be. I love artwork and murals and painting and art, but I'm, clinking glasses is not a...
I think we're trying to get direction from you on the size and the placement. We are going to bring back the specific design to you.
Good.
Because we want you to see the final result. But we need some, because staff needed direction on it, and we needed direction. We need your help to say, well, we can have a mural there and then bring it back. But we're not trying to make it a large sign. We're obviously making it artistic and actually an asset to the building and the community. So that's our direction.
Good.
And Member Dornbecker, I think your comment that you could favor a landscape, but that you didn't want to see bottles or glasses of wine, I think that's a great value to them in helping them move forward and deciding how to shape it.
Oh, good.
I feel like I want to speak up a little bit. I really read this as that a mural's on the wall, painted on the wall. So if we want to consider it a mural, I think it should be literally paint on the wall, etched on the wall, however they want to put it on the wall. But I feel like if it is a separate piece that is then tacked to the wall in some, or attached to the wall in some way, that really starts leaning more and more to being a sign. So I would even be okay with the location as long as it was a little bit more subdued on the wall as opposed to removed from the wall, attached like the signs are.
The reason why I think we went forward with the idea of doing a painting on the tin was more so to the era, the time, the style of the building, the style of the architecture, and then the style of the sign by having it kind of distressed. And we were trying to then not emulate specifically, but trying to pull what the signage or what mural or design work was done at the turn of the century in some European buildings. So we did a fairly extensive study on it and saw that a lot of it was just artwork that was painted right onto tin signs and then affixed to the building. Granted, it wasn't always a sign, but sometimes it was, and sometimes it was just an artist expression on the side of a building. So that was where we came up with the idea that we could either do it affixed or we could either paint it on the building. And we wanted to play that kind of that element of continuous, or that same, what's the word I'm looking for, that similar feel between the signage and then whatever elements we were affixing to the building. We didn't know if it was going to be obviously, and it didn't, or if it didn't mend well with the painted on the building and then having a distress sign on the side of the building. So we wanted to make it as uniform as possible.
Thank you. We are establishing precedent here. And we have an applicant that is willing to fit into our standards at the moment, but we need to write it in stone so we don't change the town. Last paragraph that you object to on the mission statement. Well, it is, it's subjective,
Sure.
and it's, we have to anticipate what might come up in the future. I don't know how we're going to do that.
I would push for the murals being painted on the building. I think that the material of the building really lends itself to that type of treatment anyway. I really love the tin sign, and I think emphasizing that sign by having it stand alone will actually be a greater benefit to the sign itself. The content to me doesn't really have anything to do with whether it's a mural or a sign. If it were solid black or clouds or whatever, and still presented in the same way as it is here on the drawing, I'd still say it's part of the sign. It's a separate panel, but it's part of a larger sign. And so just to summarize, to try to refocus, I'd like to see it painted on the building, and I think having the Summerston Wine Company, the aged tin sign, would be a really great look on its own, standalone.
And that makes good sense. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's what I agree with. And then obviously content, it feels like is a different thing, but I would have to go with the idea of doing more landscape. I mean, even the idea of that, I know it just fit in here. I know you guys are just looking for guidance and stuff, but those French signs tend to be a little bit brighter colors too than I think our earth toned range that we're kind of going for. So maybe something a little bit more subdued.
Are you comfortable with that?
I like that idea, actually, having the murals painted directly onto the building and having your tin sign, which I think looks very nice too, separate. And so it's clear that the murals are artwork and your sign is your sign. I don't really like the idea of incorporated into the mural, personally.
But Sandra, would these be limited? A mural sounds to me as though it's, you know, the wall would be painted. Are these limited?
The definition of a mural in the sign ordinance leaves that open. It allows it to be affixed to the wall. So it goes beyond just the more generalized concept of a painted mural on the building wall.
But I don't
Or
think,
otherwise applied to the wall is the language it reads.
but we don't actually have a limit on how big the mural could be, do we? There's no square
Oh.
footage or limit to it.
No.
So that's what you're asking.
So I'm wondering, this is an academic discussion, I haven't heard anything, but if the Ranch Market decided to use that space that faces south and put a pasture of cows on it, we would be endorsing that by permitting this?
Not specifically. Murals need to come before you for review, so you would look at that wall and determine whether a mural fit on that wall, just as you're looking at this building and this mural and whether it works. It's very building specific.
Okay, that's fair enough. Yeah, I thought we were just handing people a blank check, and it made me very nervous.
No, you still retain authority to review and approve all murals throughout town.
But that does raise a question, and that is this the proposed size of your mural? Is it just going to be in that corner, or is this just as a space holder, or?
Well, I guess some of that would be up for question as to now that we've gotten some or generalized guidance here on what we can do and what we feel like we should do, muted colors more so, or more to the period, and then the idea of it being more landscape oriented or whatever specifically that we do, then looking at those images from several different size or scapes, looking at it from maybe painted on half the wall or maybe painted in the square footage that we were looking at from the tin signs, whatever looks appropriate for that building at that time, and that's when we would come back to you and then we would make that determination at that point.
That makes sense.
Any more questions of the applicant?
Nope.
I'm going to close the public hearing, and we're going to discuss this among
Well,
ourselves.
are we breaking this into two pieces?
I think
Or
we
should we discuss the rest of it?
What do you think?
We've kind of been discussing it so far as two pieces. Just want
Yeah.
to make sure that then if there's more public comment on the other piece.
Okay. Yeah, I think we need to discuss murals in general, and this one in particular. Doesn't that seem reasonable?
Well, the mural's going to come back to us,
Yes.
separate from the signs that we're considering
Right.
tonight. I think we've given the applicant fairly clear direction on where we'd be, in general, headed with the murals themselves, in terms of not necessarily size, but placement, color, content,
yeah.
one way or the other. And I think we all seem more or less agreeable on the actual sign on that elevation. I think we're all fairly amenable to that. But we still have some discussion left for the west-facing sign, west-facing signs.
Okay, let's discuss that specifically, the west-facing sign. You want to start with that?
Right. Again, like the tin sign, I'm very much in favor of these letters and how they're stood off from the face of the building with the, it's not shown on the elevation, but I understand that there's that band, the painted band behind it. I think that's going to be very nice. My only, and I'm, just to note, I'm supportive of staff's suggestion of leaving off the gold leaf and just doing the etching to try to make it more cleaner, at least in terms of the process. My only thing is the wine tasting sign being emphasized in very much the same way in terms of font sizing as the business name sign. And if I had my preference, I would like to see that made more like 6 or 4 inch. I think. Oh, it is? Oh, I thought it was 8. Okay, so they're both 8 inch, and I understand that the Summerston Wine Company font is heavier and more obvious. But I think that for me, it's a little bit confusing having them emphasized on as the same font size. Is what I'm trying to say.
Okay,
Those are my only comments.
thank you. Rob?
Yeah, I agree with most of what staff said too. I think we should keep it that, make sure that we do reduce it to the 0.5 square feet overall. And then I had the same thing. I felt like the wine tasting portion being the same size as the name was a little odd, and I felt like that should be reduced. Also, the gold leaf as well. Agreed with that we should leave off the gold leaf or add it on and consider it a sign per what the ordinances say. And then the other thing I was a little concerned about is I agree with staff on the fact that we've got a lot of signage for that one building. It is bigger, but I'm foreseeing somebody coming in, excuse me, to the new place or the place that hasn't been occupied yet and coming to us and wanting more signage than is there right now, because that's pretty minimal. So it'd be great if we could leave more space for them to allow signage, as per what our ordinance says, that it should be equal distribution between the two, considering their frontages. I think that's pretty much all I've got. Yep.
Thank you.
I agree with staff's recommendations, with the exception, when the exceptions have been met, and I would vote to approve the application.
I can't improve on that. I concur. Did you want a vote from us?
Yes, we need a vote on this.
I move that we approve the criteria for the sign review and findings with the exceptions that have been met, and approve application 09SR03.
There are also 2 proposed conditions.
And with the proposed conditions of the not gold leaf, and what's the other one?
Sign area of 32 square feet.
Sign area of 32 square feet.
Second?
I'll second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
Rob?
No.
Okay, I will vote for it, so it's a 3-1. Before we finalize that, would you give us your arguments one more time, so we...
Well, I think that it should be equally spaced between frontages.
Didn't we cover that?
That wasn't one of the proposed ones that she just mentioned.
I would like to see that included.
Can I make a suggestion? I'm an ex-city planner, and I feel like if you looked at this building frontage from left to right, we're kind of getting penalized for the amount of square footage we have. If you included the center area, which is really connected with the trellis, that's 14 square feet, which would give us another 7 square feet of signage we could allocate to the other tenant, which I think you could allow that.
Do we?
It's really not very much. It's like a 2.5 by 2.5 foot sign. So it's still very conservative.
Our ordinance determines the amount of signage based on the building frontage, so technically it's the building and not the courtyard entry.
Okay, so
Determines that number.
is Rob, I agree with Rob that whatever signage that second building needs should be allocated before the fact, not afterwards.
I guess what's up for you to decide is whether to accept the 4.5 square feet shown or to increase that by some amount up to 11.5 feet, which would be the amount allowed based on the building frontage, if that's something you may agree on or not.
Is that including the arbor area?
No, the arbor and the courtyard entry are not included because that's not technically a building, and signage is based on 1/2 square foot of signage for each lineal foot of building frontage.
So does Marita need to reword her motion?
I think you need to come to an agreement first. I'm not sure if that's there. And by increasing the one building, that means reducing the other, so to have that discussion as well.
So are you saying they should be equal or they should be proportionate?
Proportional.
Yeah,
I think proportional I can agree with,
yeah,
based on their frontage.
yeah.
Which would be 20.5 for one and 11.5 for the other, just so we're clear.
That kind of digs into our signage. I mean, we're very, very conservative at the moment, so isn't there any way to increase the overall signage by the board in general?
Thank you.
We're
Hasn't that been done in the past? I mean, a few square feet?
we're not prepared to negotiate that at this point.
If you were to make findings for an exception, which isn't something that's been analyzed, but you could look over those findings and find that more signage is reasonable for this site based on the conditions that they face. And we should look to what those exceptions are. There are 5 of them. And if you think you can make those, the total signage amount could be increased. And the first one is that there are exceptional circumstances applicable to the property. Another is that it would result in an unnecessary or practical difficulty or hardship not attributed to the applicant or owner. The third, that it doesn't constitute a grant of special privilege. The fourth, that it will not be materially detrimental to the public welfare or property. And the fifth, that it will not be inconsistent with the general purpose or intent of the sign ordinance.
I don't find those apply to this. How does anyone else feel?
Those aren't, that, it would involve the applicant coming back to us in a new application that,
You could do that here today if you wanted to make those findings. It is a lot harder because staff hasn't drafted them for you for your acceptance. So it is something that's a little hard to craft on the dais.
but the application wasn't, it wasn't publicly noticed given those, I mean, are we
Well,
really?
you're just concerned about the allocation, so I'm trying to come up with a practical solution tonight that might add 5 square feet.
Yeah, I don't think we can do that. I think, if you'll forgive me, I'm going to close the public meeting and let us determine this.
Given my rough calcs, I've never been a math whiz, but if the wine tasting sign were cut, say, in half, then that would buy you some extra square footage on the other building, a couple at least. And then I think reach one of our objectives, and that is that it seems to be overemphasized, in my opinion, anyway. And so that might be one way of dealing with that. It wouldn't, I'm not saying that it would balance out the allocation in signage and square footage and such, but that would be a start, and that would be a fairly easy fix if the applicant was amenable to that.
Rob, does that wash?
Yeah, I don't know how much that is without doing the math myself.
Well, the wine tasting sign is approximately 5 square feet. If 2.5 square feet is allocated to the building next door, that would increase that to 7 square feet.
Versus how much for the main building, the Summerston building?
23?
Well, 2.5.
28, so it would be reducing 28 by 2.5 feet. So 25.5 versus 7. And granted, the north building is larger, so it should have a greater amount of signage based on the allocation.
That's what I see. I also see that we're talking about a future tenant. There is that much allocated for their sign for now, right? There's
4.5 square feet.
4.5.
Yes.
And I have a premonition that the future tenant is going to come to us and say, I need more signage.
So if we reduced the wine tasting sign by half, it would give it 11 feet, 11 and a half feet on?
No, it would only bring it up to 7.
Seven, excuse me. Well, the Summerston Wine Company building is larger, and so I don't think that they need to be equal, just as we said before.
Proportional.
Rob
Proportionate.
mentioned proportional.
And is that has not been read into this acceptance, right?
No.
You don't need an exception to allocate the signage
Oh.
differently.
No, I'm trying to,
To increase the signage beyond 32 square feet, you would need to make some exceptions.
I'm not interested in making exceptions. I'm interested in wording this in such a way that the proportions reflect the size of the two buildings. And we haven't done that yet, correct?
No.
No, you haven't.
No.
You've been throwing around a couple ideas, reducing the wine tasting by 2.5 feet so that the future tenant has 7 feet, and you've also mentioned making it proportional, which means 20.5 for Building A and 11.5 for Building B.
Okay, and where do you stand on that now?
I think by giving them a couple extra square feet on the other building buys them, it can take form in a lot of different ways, but it'll buy them one extra etching on the window. It'll buy them a bigger spread on the awning. I think it helps balance it out a little bit. I respect the applicant's desire to have the brand name emphasized, and I don't suggest trying to tone that down at all, but I think the wine tasting is a good target, for lack of a better word, to try to buy some extra square footage for the smaller building.
I think we're going to be split 2 and 2 on this. How do you stand?
No, I can agree with that. If, it will be more proportional, and I could go with that. How about you, Rob?
I guess I just don't feel like these exceptions are met in any way that should justify changing what I feel like is what our town sign ordinance is that it should be bilinear frontages proportional.
And I agree with them, so there we are. Where are we? Do we make that split recommendation to the council? That we
No,
just,
the decision is yours.
and we're divided 2 and 2.
It's almost as if that motion has failed because there's not
Yeah,
a majority opinion.
okay. So where do we go from there?
Can I make one last comment?
No, the meeting is closed.
closed,
We have to work this out. Do you want to try to verbalize something that maybe they will agree with?
Well, I feel like I appreciate the effort to try to, I agree that the wine tasting one should be smaller, and I feel like it should be That should give more space to the future tenant, and that all that effort. But I feel like 4.5, 6.5, 7.5. It's all not what the town ordinance is trying to get at. That it would be proportionate. So whether it's 8.5, I feel like it was pretty directive, and I feel like I understand Summerson Wine Company is here, and obviously they want their business promoted, but I just feel like there's going to be a future tenant, and our role is to keep it even so that when that future tenant comes in, that they have the same rights that anybody else would have had.
I agree with you. So how can we, how can you persuade us, or how can we persuade you?
I don't know.
Bob, can you help us out on this? Come and cut this baby in half.
Because the issue is not allocation. You already agreed that the one building is larger. It comes down to the exception. And there's two that can make those findings. Is that the case?
That's the case. Two of us can make the findings, two of us cannot.
Then we're talking an extra 5 square feet.
I haven't done
Is that what's at issue?
It's 6 square feet added to one building and taken off of the other. Or 7.5 square feet, I'm sorry. 7.
But that
7
still
total.
puts it over the total
No.
limit. It doesn't.
They're speaking of modifying the proportions of the signage rather than adding more to go above 32 square feet total.
So it's not a variance in that sense.
Right. We mentioned that they could make the findings for an exception if they, to exceed the 32 square feet. But they have a split decision on whether it should be proportional or whether it should be some other allocation between the two buildings. Without agreement.
And would an exception be needed if the Summerson Wine Company sign and the wine tasting lettering were incorporated into one sign?
There would still be an exception required for the north sign, yes.
For the north sign?
If you can't agree on this, it fails and the applicant doesn't have approval, what they would have to do is go back and redesign as best they could to bring something before you that they think they can get approved. And that's what your action tonight would put upon them.
I hate to put them through that. I'm going to open it up and let them speak again. Would the applicant address this? No. Yes. I'm sorry. If you would like to speak on this issue, I think.
I think looking at the buildings themselves, and I agreed with, when Rob is saying that it needs to be within the city or the town ordinance, that it's proportional. But if you look at the two buildings, especially when you have a north-facing space that's going to be very visible, and then you have that west-facing space of that building that's 2 stories tall and much longer, there's so much more exposure to that building that it almost grants the idea of having more signage. If it means that the wine tasting portion needs to migrate down to a smaller amount and then share that small amount with the other tenant, that's fine. We're very comfortable with that. But I still believe strongly that that building itself, the larger building, really demands more exposure of signage.
Okay, fair enough. And I would challenge you to make the findings. They designed this building. They didn't inherit it. They didn't buy it. They designed the building.
Well, my concern is that we fly in the face of the spirit of the ordinance, and not just the sign ordinance, but our design ordinance. The building has a lot of articulation, and there's a lot of windows, and there's a lot of stuff going on in the building. I don't know if it's enough to technically make the first finding for the exception, but in the spirit of both ordinances, I would hate to enforce them strictly and then come back with something different with the building or something. I think we have some quality signs that are going into this building, and I don't, by enforcing the ordinance to the T and strictly, I don't want to come back with something of less quality or something that's been tacked on somewhere else just to make the numbers work. That's my biggest concern. I think we can play a little bit with the numbers and get some more square footage for the smaller building.
I have something that may help. This is a master sign plan property, which gives you a little more flexibility than if these two buildings sat on separate parcels. In that case, they'd be strictly held to the signage allowed based on frontage. But since it's a master sign plan, you can look at the fact that Building A is a larger two-story with more mass and use that as the reason to grant it a little bit more.
And my position is that Building B is not represented. And if we make the findings that Building A should be the exception, once Building B has a tenant, we're going to go through this all over again. Isn't that your point?
I mean, that's part of it. I feel like we are doing that. That's why Building A gets twice as much signage as Building B does, because we're talking about proportionality. We're not talking about equality here. I mean, I'm not saying that the smaller building should have, you know, what half would be like.
Yeah, it should be.
Set 16 square feet or something like that.
You're not weakening? Okay. Well, we think what we think, you know. We can agree to disagree.
I guess what I would support is, you know, trying to come back with something much closer. I understand that we could be a little bit more flexible because it is a master sign plan, but I don't feel like that should be hashed out right here, per se. I feel like we might need just a different proposal. If they could get up to like 11. I don't know. I kind of feel like if we're giving a little bit of leeway, why not give them the whole thing? Like, I don't know if 8 is enough, or 9 is enough, or 7 is enough. I'm just guided by the sign ordinance, I guess.
Should we all go home?
Well, given what's at the center of the difference between the two votes here, we were just talking about it. It's something that it's not easy to suggest a remedy to that if it's a question of proportioning out the total amount of signage, one building to the other, or more for the one. I'm afraid I don't have any suggestion that was going to provide any new guidance for you. But you're right. When the new tenant comes in, they'll have their own interest in being represented in signage as well. And if it comes down to the total sign quantity that's allocated is gone, it's gone, and they get what's left, or what the result of the decision is. And they'll have to accept that going in.
Yeah, so I can't go along with the motion as it is presented.
No, that motion failed.
Okay, so where do we go from here?
Can we present a new motion?
Yeah, you
Yes,
can present a
yes.
new motion, but we're still up against the same walls.
Normally, I mean, if it's at a total impasse, or unless you want to have more discussion and make another motion, the best that could come out of this is some direction, some guidance to the applicant to return with something that, but there doesn't seem to be a tiebreaker on this one.
But you could approve the 11 and the 22, and then we'll readjust the signage. That's what you're really saying. So we adjust the wine tasting and whatever else on our building, and you can't approve that because that's what the ordinance allows, so you could say that to us.
You could.
We'd like to not come back.
Yeah, of course. So would you go with that?
Oh, I'd be okay with that, sure.
Would you? Okay. We're there?
I mean, yeah, if they're going to do that, I mean, the other option is for them to present a whole other one that does fall within the guidelines. But if they're here and they're okay with that, I feel like we could pass that motion or
I mean,
something.
you can do that, and then we bring it back to staff. They're capable of seeing that we've reduced the square footage.
Absolutely, thank you. Okay, are we all right with that? Do you need that verbalized?
Yes, let's take a motion so it's clear.
Is anybody willing to put that in English?
What are the targets here for the square footage again?
It's 20 and a half and 11 and a half.
20 and a half?
I mean, yeah.
20 and a half and 11 and a half. 20 and a half for one building and 11 and a half for the other, is that right?
I'll move to approve the application submitted in concept with the following conditions, that building A, the sign square footage be reduced to 20 and a half, and building, well, I'm just calling building, the north building be reduced to 20 and a half square footage, the southern building be allotted 11 and a half square footage, and this is all subject to approval at the staff level. I'd have the applicant come back to staff, and then retain the originally proposed condition of approval number 2. The window signs may be etched, but shall not include gold leaf.
I'll second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Whoa, wasn't that easy? All right, sorry to put you through that, but you have a motion and you're free to move on. Okay, so we will go to climate control, which is getting warmer. Good luck to you.
Thank you.
9.1, climate protection program inventory.
Did we go get member James? Oh.
I'm back.
That was a good one to sit out.
You use a fifth vote?
Pardon?
Yeah.
That was a fifth vote on that one.
Okay.
Whose report is this?
So item 9.1 is the climate protection program, the inventory. And climate protection issues are becoming, have come to the California legislature. And they, in 2006, they passed Global Warming Solutions Act, which is AB 32. And that is a statewide program that seeks to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that are generated in California to 1990 levels by the year 2020, and those increase to an 80% reduction by the year 2050. On a parallel track, there's also SB 375, which coordinates transportation and land use planning issues on a regional level. So these are some of the state laws that are informing the work that's being done within the county. In September of 2007, the council passed a resolution authorizing the town to work with NCTPA and the other Napa Valley jurisdictions to create a climate protection plan. And in June of 2008, the NCTPA board approved MIG as the consultant to lead that effort and coordinate between the different jurisdictions. And the climate protection plan really has 5 components. The first is to conduct a greenhouse gas emissions inventory and to determine the source of emissions within the town. The second is to establish a greenhouse gas emissions reduction target to meet the AB 32 goals, which need to be at least 1990 levels by the year 2020. The third is to develop an action plan to reach that reduction target, and then implementing and monitoring the plan are the final stages in that process. The item before you tonight, or the items are number 1 and 2 in this milestone process. And MIG created the greenhouse gas emissions inventory that is in attachment A, and it includes attachment C, which provides the methodology that they used for coming up with those numbers. They used a variety of information sources from the year 2005 because 1990 data is unavailable. So this 2005 data looked at PG&E, the California Energy Commission. It used the Metropolitan Transportation Commission data, Caltrans, Integrated Waste Management Board, Upper Valley Waste Management Authority, CARB, the California Air Resources Board, in addition to Bay Area Air Quality Management District and town records on energy usage to come up with these numbers. It's important to note that the inventory that resulted from this data is really is based on the best available data, since we don't, and it establishes a big picture since we don't know all sources of greenhouse gas emissions, such as backyard composting, propane and agricultural emissions, things of that nature. So the report identifies that Yountville's emissions of 28,267 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent are broken down into approximately 62% for the built environment, the commercial and residential environment, and the transportation sector accounts for about 26% of our emissions. The others are smaller percentages, and they include solid waste, garden emissions, and other off-road vehicles. The inventory also identifies what the Napa County emissions are, and it's over 1 million metric tons. And countywide, the largest sector of emissions is transportation. There's a section in that report that estimates what the emissions will be in 2020 based on current growth patterns. And it indicates that Yountville's growth will see an increase of 12.8%. The emissions target is geared at meeting that AB 32 goal, which is 1990 levels by 2020. But since that 1990s data is difficult to obtain, it's generally a functional equivalent as a 15% reduction of the 2005 levels that the inventory report was based on. So we're presenting this report to you to review and comment upon and to acknowledge the reduction target. We'll be bringing this to council at a later point, more as an introduction to them.
So the target is 15% by 2020 of the 2005.
Sandra, what force or effect, if any, is our acknowledgement of the reduction target?
Not much, since it's a statewide requirement.
Okay.
And the council has previously bought into the ICLEI goals and participating in that.
It looks like that while overall in the county, the largest source of emissions are from transportation, in our town it is from households. Isn't that correct?
And the commercial built environment.
And the commercial built environment.
Those two are kind of flip numbers from the county. We have half of the on-road vehicles that the county has, and we have double or more than double the commercial industrial that the
This-
county has.
This information is important in being able to craft actions that will address our problem area, and that being the built environment. We're
Right.
different from the county. And in the next staff report that I present, the county as a whole is trying to come up with actions to address these needs, and it's important to note that we have different factual situations that apply, and the same actions won't have the same result or impact.
So, based on that, I have a question about the community center. What mitigation is there built into the community center for emissions, if any?
The community center is built to the LEED standard, and I
good.
believe they're targeting
So it would be
the goal.
solar?
There's solar on the building, there's, I believe, geothermal. It's intended to be a zero net energy building, but they deal with all aspects of green building techniques, essentially.
Good.
And that method of building is certainly a big component towards reducing emissions later, what you'll be looking at. Adoption of green building codes and as a means to get to this reduction of
Exactly.
15%.
I did notice somewhere too, there was a recommendation that there be some sort of promotion or benefit to town residents to change their emissions by going solar or whatever. Is that true?
The action plan, I believe, incorporates some energy efficiency components to encourage homeowners to make those upgrades and to provide some level of funding for that. Thank you.
The town does already fund a rebate program, which I happily took advantage of if you buy a new washer and dryer.
This chart would be
Should I introduce the
Yeah,
next
that's kind
one
of
too? We're
what you're
sort of
talking
discussing
about
them
is an
together.
operating
Sorry, am I
these
getting ahead of the-
methodologies to reduce.
These were the draft actions in this chart that were created by by staff of the 6 valley jurisdictions, and it's broken down into these 6 separate segments. What the consultant was wanting was to get key stakeholder and decision maker input on these measures by August 15th, but since publishing the staff report, the town and city managers have met, and they want to revise this more. So we expect that this will change, and this would come back before you. So you probably don't need to go into the same level of detail or discussion that we requested in the staff report.
Yeah, but for your interest, some of these like BE5 and some of these programs under buildings and energy are certainly right along the lines that you are talking about, where they would, well, for instance, they would have to assess a building prior to its construction, the emissions, and like in BE5, and then assess greenhouse gas emissions due to energy use and to incorporate energy and water conservation measures into projects along with other features and programs. So the whole green building code that will be following on later is towards that.
For future development. But what about the development that already exists.
Well, there'll be
They're in here,
thresholds for
too.
when the green building codes will apply to residential in particular. The commercial are a little more, the threshold's lower, but that's almost the crux of the matter for deciding. The codes themselves are fairly set. It's when it applies. And I think that's going to be the whole discussion, really, of what's fair, what's the significant amount of work to when they would trigger.
Especially since buildings, both commercial and residential, are what comprise most of the emissions in our town. Thank you.
I guess I have a little bit of a question. Please excuse me if I'm jumping in. But what exactly, because we're not coming up with an action plan, we're not even really discussing this list you gave us. What would you like us to do other than just acknowledge we received this and that sounds good? I mean, I took tons of notes on ideas for an action plan, but I feel like that's out of the scope of what this discussion is, correct?
It is the recommended action for 9.2. 9.1 is fairly perfunctory. We just acknowledge them. But 9.2, I believe we're encouraged to discuss the actions. And I think, Rob, we'd welcome some of yours.
Okay, so I guess that's part of my question. This sounded like we were just the emissions reduction target. Yes, 15% less than the 2005 setting. Sounds good. They're experts more than I am on that.
That's step one, and then step two is this larger set of goals and action plans, and we're encouraged to provide comment to it.
Unless, for some reason, there were strong feelings about the achievability of those goals somehow.
But as you said, we can't really do much other than acknowledge the state mandated goal, and a goal to which the council has already agreed.
That's essentially correct. Yeah, we're acknowledging those and working to them then. The big discussion, our larger discussion, I suppose, would come under the action plan.
And so I think for Mr. Winterberg, there is a big opportunity to discuss all of those. I'll lead with just the one, and I'll freely admit that it's greatly informed by my occupation, but what I'll call policy goal SW1, the town, as part of the Upper Valley Waste Management Authority, has, in my experience, by granting Upper Valley Disposal an exclusive franchise for construction debris, has created a powerful disincentive, and I speak from a great deal of experience, has created a powerful disincentive to divert construction material because of the rate structure that Upper Valley has.
And
So I would strongly encourage the town to consider revising that franchise agreement. I support the franchise as it relates to household pickup. I understand that. It's like first-class mail. It would be prohibitively expensive for people in outlying areas if we all didn't have that. But for this sort of one-off construction debris, when you only have one vendor with whom you can deal, it's a very powerful disincentive.
Unless you sell it, isn't that correct?
Yes, you can sell. I think, to my recollection, reading the mind-numbing franchise agreement, that's really geared towards bottles and cans. I do think, though, construction debris, where it's considered a divertible material, you are allowed to sell it. I don't know people that are really buying it, per se. And I need to get off a soapbox because it relates too much to my work, but Upper Valley charges a rental fee for its dumpsters. So the cost of having dumpsters sit until they're full can make it less expensive, and it frequently does, merely to mix the trash and the divertible material together. So we're asking people to spend more. Other jurisdictions in which I work, yes, the household pickup is a franchise, but construction debris is a competitive market. Now, one could argue if, one company is trucking it 100 miles, that's not good, but I don't think here in this community that's the case. It'd get made into compost in Napa and Calistoga. So with that said, that's the one policy that I think is, the current structure is inefficacious. It won't yield to it, and I'll yield to Mr. Winterberg.
And I have a problem with this. Is there hard evidence to suggest that fossil fuel usage is the contributing factor to global warming? Or is that a leap of faith?
The scientific community,
Is divided. Is divided.
I believe, is more strongly in favor of the fact that it leads to
But that,
global warming.
if they're in favor, there should be evidence. And I've only been allowed to accept what other folks say. I don't know what they're basing that on. You know, there's certainly nothing wrong with conservation. And that's a idea that Teddy Roosevelt brought in. But as far as a causal relationship, I'd like to see some hard evidence.
Well, I think there are studies that show the particulate matter that is causing the ozone layer to disappear and things.
The ozone layer is disappearing. The certainly the glaciers are melting. That's that's hard evidence. You can see that. But the causal factor, I would like to see presented.
There are studies to that effect.
Okay, if you could get those to me, email, I'd be happy to read them.
Okay. I
Yeah.
actually have them. I'll forward you. The Pew Institute is one of the organizations of scientists that have produced a lot of documentation and proof.
Okay,
so.
all right, great. Okay.
To talk about, I guess, targets a little bit, I think obviously our built environment is the majority of what we have here. But I thought it was interesting that they said on-road vehicles is actually going to be the largest increase between now and 2020. I just want to keep that on the forefront of, I think we all think of ourselves as a pretty small town here, but that's where they're showing the largest growth by almost double everything else. I mean, significant difference in the percentage of growth there. So I just want to keep that in as part of our discussion. I'm a huge proponent of more green ordinances here in Yountville, but I also want us to consider, obviously, the larger picture. To that effect, I remember a while ago, and I imagine it's disappeared, we talked about bikes in town. And I noticed that didn't come under transportation and mobility. So that's one thing that I've thought of. Also, I know probably business owners are not likely to agree, but I'd love to see more walking traffic, less roads, whether that means consideration of closing some of the roads, whether that means consideration of wider walking paths and such. I think all those things. As it is right now, there's places where there's no sidewalk, and there's places where there's no crosswalk, where the sidewalk ends, and things like that. So it really makes walking less of a pleasure in town. So I think things like that would be important to consider, especially under transportation and mobility. I've got a whole list, but I don't feel like sitting here and going through the whole thing, so maybe I'll
Well, I would
present it
encourage
to
you to,
staff.
if you have comments on those.
All right. I love the idea of the bike path. Unfortunately, I think probably our tourists are not the type that are going to jump on their bike and ride up here to go to French Laundry for the evening. So I don't think that's, I think that will be probably a great tourist attraction, but I don't think that's actually going to reduce our amount of fossil fuels produced by driving to Yountville. Yeah, I really hope that we get on a green plan for zoning and ordinances. I think that could be a huge benefit to us and could hit a lot. I mean, I was looking at the amount that we've produced and how much of it comes from our built environment and how much probably comes from our business environment here in town. So I think it's important that we really start drafting something that doesn't just only include new buildings, but includes some incentives for retrofitting some of these old buildings and adding more solar panels and things like that. To that note, I bet our our pollution's even greater than we think, because I saw in there that wood-burning stoves are not considered. So fireplaces and all the particulate produced that way is not even considered in this. And since we do have such a built environment in all the residential areas, I imagine it's even higher than this could actually capture. I think there'd be a great idea, and obviously I don't know all the finances. I'm not a budget person, but I know a huge portion of our money comes from TOT taxes, the taxes on all the hotels and inns in town. And if we could come up with some format where we could give them TOT breaks, since obviously that's the only tax we really give them, in order to, in promotion of energy efficient standards to a lot of our inns in town, just as one way that we could make it more reasonable for them to do such. I think right now the problem is inertia. Everybody's, I have my hotel, I have my inn, why should I change, other than some moral standard? I feel like if we could provide more of these incentives, more people might actually take a move to, hey, you know, masonry could have been built with solar panels on its roof or something along those lines. I'm just picking on that one because it popped in my head. I don't mean anything particular to that. Definitely, I think, I don't know how the structure is going to be created, but I think there could be a lot of discussion here. So I don't know. It sounds like subcommittee might be the word. Otherwise, I can imagine hours and hours and hours of discussion on zoning standards. I know it all has to be approved, but it might be a worthwhile effort. To that end, actually, I just saw on NBC 2 nights ago, they're talking about selling green, and it is one of the areas of realty market that's still going well. So I think it should really be something that we consider more and more often. Oh, and then community engagement. That entire section, I'm huge on. I've been a teacher. I do talks on psychology and the behavior of recycling. I think there's amazing opportunities with the new community center coming in as a LEED certified building that we could actually provide a whole bunch of trainings, classes, everything from organic farming and gardening there at the center. And I just think it provides a great opportunity to use a LEED certified building to promote more green activities. So I hope we have a whole host of options there. I think that probably hits all the major points for me. Sorry to go on a little bit of a tirade, but I wanted to make sure I get all that.
That's good to hear.
We have walked the town in wheelchairs to see what's accessible and what is not. So it's not, there are still areas of improvement. And of course, those sidewalks where parking is permitted, where you can't walk, that's not going to be fixed.
I've got a couple comments. Starting with transportation, T3, the multi-use countywide trail, I think is an excellent idea. I think it needs to be a little bit more, I know these are just kind of vanilla objectives here, but it needs to be more explicit about it being at least a class 1 type trail. I think that tourists, yes, will use it, but it also presents opportunities for locals to use it as a transportation corridor. I would consider biking to work if that was in place. T6, the Highway 29 corridor between Vallejo and downtown Napa for bus and rail transit. I think maybe there should be an added one, or as part of that, the Napa Wine Train corridor is an opportunity that shouldn't be ignored. Now that Santa Elena allows the wine train to stop in Santa Elena rather than just turn around and go back the other way, it could accommodate a commuter car or something to that effect, and it'll probably also increase its runs now that it has stops to make. I was excited to learn that you can catch it here in Yountville to go to Cheers Santa Elena, but it costs $30. You're paying just as much as the folks down in Napa, so I think there's some opportunities there that really need to be fleshed out, but I think it could really work and it'd be a good thing. in the ag section, I'm a little, no, I'm very uncomfortable with AN 3, assess the impact of land use changes, new vineyards, and urban development on carbon sequestration. My problem with that is making vineyards sound like part of the problem. And I think instead vineyards present a tremendous opportunity to divert food waste. And I know this is already done in part, but I think local jurisdictions can start to take more advantage of the vineyards surrounding us. They're already, I would argue, lower impact than some hardscape development. And so I think that if I had the opportunity, I would definitely reword that and focus more on the roles of and opportunities that vineyards play in environmental enhancement and partnerships that jurisdictions can forge with vineyards and such. And then lastly, along the lines of Rob's comment on community engagement, I think if this is all going to work and we're going to develop our own local policies given this framework, I think one thing, and this goes back to one of my own special interests, but I think policymakers and leaders need to be educated, at least in the basics of behavior change theory. And there's some basic rule of thumb rules out there that are really easy to grasp, and that can aid policymakers in how policies are developed and how outreach occurs. And so behavior change theory, and there's some social marketing principles that if everyone just kind of had a basic understanding of, I think policies would be more useful and would engage greater environmental behavior, environmentally benign behavior, I guess you could say. So that's it.
I have a question, excuse me. Didn't you say, though, at the beginning of this conversation that the action plan framework was going to be reassessed and reframed by the town council?
Probably by staff with the consultant before it's brought back, so these comments can be taken as part of that process.
Oh, good.
Part of the issue there is these ideas are here, but there is no assessment of their relative effectiveness, and then cost is certainly going to be asked by the council of what's the most effective for the cost and before they adopt anything. And that's part of what they're going to be working on.
I see. Thank you.
So what do you want from us? Have we done it? Okay.
Yes.
Staff and board reports?
We're beginning to see applications for some of the approved developments here in town. The Sorrento project has submitted for building permit, and they haven't pulled yet, but they're finalizing their documents, essentially. We understand that Vita will be coming in soon with their building permit package, and I believe they've already submitted for a foundation-only permit and a demolition. I thought I had another one on my mind, but I can't think of it.
Good either. There, let's see. Landscaping will be going in at Coffee Caboose. There was a couple of minor changes that staff has allowed. They want to put a circular, kind of a 8-foot raised planter in the middle of the large area with a tree in it to get some, I guess, shade in that area. And then their sign location, they're thinking about moving it a little bit as well. But it's still going to be in that general front area there. Let's see what else. Bardesano may be coming in for a sign, and they're having a problem of being identified by first-time visitors, then they've actually had the problem of people thinking the community center is part of the Bardesano and it's under construction, and they get confused, and that's why that temporary banner is up, that we allowed that. So they're proposing possibly a new sign at the edge of the park to where the vineyard starts, right off of Yount there. As you come around the corner, it'd be more towards the community center to get some presence at the Y intersection. That's what that development is. Can
I
think
guess
of anything else?
Sean has satisfied all conditions of approval except for one for their courtyard expansion, the big one being the one that they were unable to secure a lease with the church. So they're coming back before the council next week, asking for an alternative parking arrangement to use stalls at Edward James Courtyard for employees at 6 p.m. and later.
The house on Padroni is complete. That small one you approved it's been a year ago now, I guess. And
Has been demolished.
Padroni, I'm talking about Starkey, yeah. Starkey, and then the other one on Padroni, another small one. Yeah, they've done the demo and starting on that one.
What about the new businesses? Do you have any sense of how they're doing and how their competition is affected? Will we ever get that information?
Well, you mean the occupancy rates at the inns, or?
I was thinking of the taco truck as opposed to the deli, the caboose as opposed to,
Yeah, it's kind of early yet.
Okay.
Anecdotally, the taco truck's doing great, seems.
and has the deli been affected? Do we know?
Yountville Deli?
Yeah.
Normally, those sales receipts are not public.
But sales tax receipts are.
No, those are not public.
Usually not.
It's confidential information.
We can, I don't know how we would
Okay.
inform you of their.
Yeah, if it's confidential, it's confidential. Okay.
I guess there's one big thing we're leaving out is, at the last council meeting, Bob introduced Zoto revisions to the council, and this upcoming Tuesday, they're going to prioritize some of those.
Yeah, the council wanted to, since we were not going to fund the general plan, the comprehensive general plan update this budget year because of budget constraints, they did want to move ahead on some of the chronic zoning issues and design ordinance issues that have flared up over time, and like FAR and parking and uses within the residential scale commercial zone district. There was a list of 17 of them we took to the council, and they basically prioritized them into some groupings, and we're going to take, so there's going to be this rolling discussion going on at the council, and then they're going to decide what they want to work on, kind of get it in some direction to it, come to ZDRB for your comments on those topics. And we're trying to get them into manageable sizes, or 2 or 3 at a time, rather than, trying to take on a dozen at a time.
To what extent, Bob, does that list of 17 include items that have been generated from this board that we've suggested revisions to? The process you lay out troubles me somewhat in that it seems as we're going to be presented with a set list of topics where we may or may not want to add to it.
No, it's not a non-exclusive list, and as you review them, you can certainly pass suggestions up. Why don't I get the list and I'll read them off quickly to you?
Sure.
It might be informative. Just a second.
We maintain a list in the planning office, and it started with issues that Bob and I identified, but it's also included ones raised here
Good.
at ZDRB, also ones raised by council. So we tried to bring as many of those before them But we
How
were
did-
selective in trying to target big issues first, realizing there's a couple steps.
Interesting.
Like the 8-foot fence, I think that was one that was raised here.
Yes.
And that was on the list.
Interesting. How much did you pare it down to reach 17?
Probably just a handful, maybe 5 or so.
I think some of these came out of the ZDRB that we included in this list. And these are in no particular order. They're just in this order that were presented, and then they went from there as far as prioritizing them. Floor area ratio, usable open space, which is related to floor area ratio because it's usually it's kind of one or the other. Parking standards. Land use is permitted in Old Town Historic Zoning District with a use permit. This goes back to the Ginny application when they originally wanted a duplex and were required to get a use permit, and eventually met so much neighborhood opposition they abandoned that. And that was apparently a surprise to some people that that was not an exclusively single-family neighborhood, Old Town Historic. So that's one.
What's the proposed revision, Bob?
Just to
As a
discuss
resident
land
of-
use in the Old Town Historic District. Right now, it's certainly a mixture of, we have French Laundries in Old Town Historic as a retained use, and Lavender Inn, and Bordeaux House, and
But those are all retained uses.
all retained uses, but we have everything from single-family on up to multiple-family buildings, apartment buildings, corner of Madison and Washington, a couple there.
There was talk previously of adopting a much more explicit Old Town design guideline. Is that part of that discussion? Could it grow out of that discussion?
Could.
I should probably just let you read them, so I'm sorry, go on.
Let's see, design review for uses not involving construction. That one is spin-off from the taco truck application. Residential scale, commercial, again, a land use discussion of the types of uses allowed. And there's been this ongoing thing about, there's a language in the zoning ordinance that says businesses that rely principally on tourists are prohibited businesses. And then it becomes a question of, well, fundamentally, can any business exist without relying on tourists to some extent, and what's the metric for that? We don't have one. Do we even want to do that anymore? Is it feasible to do that anymore? There's a whole area there that's ripe for discussion. The two-story limitation of 50% on a block that exists for single-family dwelling units, that's in there. Heritage tree, these are kind of, some have been hovering out there for a while, and some have come up, like the taco truck one and this one. The Heritage Tree Financial Assistance request is a recent one that came up, and it states in the ordinance that if someone has a heritage tree and it needs work, they can request assistance from the town, financial assistance, if it's a hardship, but there's no measure of what that means. And just the surprise of having to work on a tree that may be an expense you're incurring, maybe a hardship to anyone, and they would write a letter to the town. So they wanted to talk about what constitutes a hardship and getting some, I guess, some basic criteria for that. The master development plan process and streamlining it. And this has been going on a while, and where we have the concept, preliminary, final. At preliminary and final, there's two meetings, one at the ZDRB and then one at the council, and then the same thing again at the final stage of the master development plan. That is seen by some as too repetitive and too complicated and burdensome. So there's been some desire to streamline that, perhaps to maybe one meeting or a concept in one meeting. Findings. This is maybe something that came out of staff more than anyone, but we have all of these findings that are frequently repetitive, from design review findings, use permit findings, impacts on adjacent uses findings and criteria. So we're looking to, and some of the findings, when you read them 3 times, and you're really not sure what it is they're after even then. So we're trying to clarify them and streamline them, consolidate them into maybe one coherent set of findings. Some cities, well, more in the old days, made it very simple. It was the health, safety, welfare, peace, moral safety of the public, and you make those findings, and if you make those, then it's approved. Not suggesting we go that simple, but something less complicated than we have now. Rear porches, FAR, and I'm trying to remember if the ZDRB got involved in the John T. application that became very complicated and controversial in the neighborhood about a rear porch being counted as part of their FAR.
Yes, we were.
Yeah, and however, if you detach it and put it over a patio, then it's a landscape element, and it's not subject to any of that. But so that's the question there of maybe definition and applicability of that as FAR. Minimum lot size. This is kind of something coming out of probably staff more than anything, of questioning whether 4,000 is really where we want to be, as opposed to the minimum. And Old Town Historic is 5,000, and that seems like a more suitable standard, even anywhere in town. But that's just putting it out there for discussion. Minimum fence heights, I think, came out of maybe a comment from the ZDRB, and the idea of the 2-foot lattice extension when it's mutually agreed to by neighbors, and having that recognized as a standard rather than a call shot. Also, the same for screen parking. That's a little confusing as to how you achieve that when most of it's right in the front yard, and how do you screen parking that's going to be obviously accessible from the street, and what does that mean to screen that parking space? I already covered that. Let's see. This other minimum lot size, I ought to give that a different name because they kind of have two same names. This one has to do with the Jacobson application, when right over in the corner here, that was a case where it was one lot, 2 houses on one lot, going way back forever. And they wanted to subdivide that lot, and each house would now be on a separate lot. And the issue became, one lot was okay as far as meeting the minimum and maximum, fitting within that minimum and maximum lot size. To begin with, the entire lot, unsubdivided, was in excess of the 8,000 square foot maximum. That's the maximum a lot can be. So we already had a non-conforming situation with the big one. Now they were going to subdivide it, and one of the lots was something like about 6,000 square feet, just fine. But the other lot still remained over 8,000 square feet at about 10,000 square feet. And then it became kind of an issue of, gee, is that okay to?
Is less non-conforming better than non-conforming, or should you not create a non-conforming?
It's more conforming, but it's still non-conforming.
This is a great list.
Yeah, and maybe putting something in there where we don't stump future ZDRBs and town councils.
And it had come up previously too, if you have a non-conforming lot, but one that's not large enough to split into two conforming lots, or one that just is the intent that an 11,000 square foot lot can be developed as an 11,000? And maybe that's okay. It's actually less dwelling because of the exceptions you get per lot. There's less massing on one larger lot, but the ordinance has always been silent on that.
Yeah.
I encourage the retention of big lots myself. But anyway.
And then miscellaneous signs, and this has to do with these open signs they're stand mounted that they stick by the door, and those have been kind of allowed forever since I've been here. And but there's no formal policy about them, and I'd like to have one. And also menu signs. At some point in Yountville's history, their menu signs were apparently a controversial thing.
Yes.
And there's a lot of verbiage in our sign ordinance about them, and they seem incredibly restricted as to how they're allowed and everything. But as a town of restaurants and inns, I mean, they're just a common feature. It's like, what's the big deal? They ought to be administrative, angst over a menu sign.
They were considered advertising, and you're right, fur and feathers flew.
Mm-hmm. So we want to maybe be a little more accepting of and less process on those signs. It is a suggestion there. Maybe they want to keep it the way it is. But and then they added a 17th item at the meeting, and it had to do with the ZDRB, and it had to do with
The lash?
The
lash?
Well, it's kind of interesting. It has to do with, they really value your recommendations that come out of ZDRB, and that
The advisory.
Yeah, they fall back on them, and they pay attention to them, and they talk about them at council when they're reviewing these applications. But I think there's a desire to have some consensus maybe of the board.
Like tonight?
And
To take a vote, so you
yeah.
have a vote that is further defined by the comments.
So
Right.
even if it's an advisory, sort of a straw poll, rather than having to sort through 5 separate sets of comments.
And I can tell you over my tenure here, at first, the ZDRB, they seem to come up to a consensus on things, and then it got to a point where there was some consensus, and then there were individual comments, and now it's almost to the point where it's just all individual comments, and there may be some overlap between some of the comments that are made, but I think the council is interested in, as a board, direction that you all are in agreement on. Not that we can't still do I didn't get the sense they didn't want the individual ones still, but they were.
No, and I didn't even get the sense that it was unanimous. The mayor, for
Yeah.
example, preferred the individual comments and the detail that it gave rather than a vote.
They didn't reach consensus on the consensus.
Yeah.
But they expect us to.
Yeah. Can they vote on that for us?
So
That's pretty, sorry.
yeah, that was the last one, and then they kind of went down the line and each gave their top, their ranking of it, and I think what's going to happen though is that they tended to fall out, and the bigger issues that are going to command a lot of attention and discussion, and then there's these smaller ones like the menu signs or the fence lattice, and that are maybe more easily done. And so we're going to try to maybe put some of the easy stuff along with the hard ones and let them take care of that right away. And then I'm not sure exactly how it's going to go, but I see this happening over several meetings, and at each point they will send some more formed up direction on these to the ZDRB for comment before they take action.
It's a pretty solid list, I think.
Yeah.
And if you have any more, that they can be sent on up.
Don't ask me that.
I think that's a good, probably half a year there at least of discussion.
Pretty solid, I think.
All right, thank you.
We need to have an election, do we not?
Oh, we thought that we were overdue, and we are overdue, but when I read the bylaws, it indicates that the vote for a chairman is to occur in September. So we're going to stick with the bylaws even though we missed a year.
Okay.
Okay.
Good.
Thanks for remembering that.
Just housekeeping. I'd renominate you, though. So, yeah, one more.
I don't think she heard you.
Well, don't repeat it.
So are we adjourned? Do I hear a motion for?
You do.
And a. Second. All in.
Aye.
We're adjourned.
Thank you, Sandra, Bob, good night.